coming up today, how Brexit broke the English language. We look at what's really inside CBD oil and run the maths on a remarkable sub-2-hour marathon attempt. Welcome to the Wired UK podcast, your weekly guide to the most interesting stories in tech, science, business and culture. I'm your host, James Templeton, and joining me are Matt Reynolds.
Hello.
Matt Burgess.
Hello.
And Vicky Turk.
Hi.
This was the week when an Ofcom study found that the people in Liverpool spend longer making calls on mobile phones than the residents of 9 other major British cities. Liverpudlians spend 6 minutes and 51 seconds on a single call, on average.
This was also the week when environmental activists Extinction Rebellion launched a new set of protests around the world, including in London and New York. In London, activists set up camp in Westminster, delayed flights at City Airport and caused road blockades in a protest for action on climate change.
And it was also the week when astronomers found 20 new moons around Saturn, which means the gas giant has leapfrogged Jupiter to become the planet in our solar system with the most known moons. It now has 82 moons to Jupiter's 79.
And finally, this was the week when 2 of the UK's footballers' wives got into a spat over Instagram. Colleen Rooney accused Rebecca Vardy of leaking stories about her to the press after she set up a social media sting where Vardy's Instagram account was the only one that could see her stories.
More like Wagatha Christie.
That is terrible.
I know, and I didn't even come up with it. I stole it from somewhere. It was pretty cool, though. Really clever.
Yeah, some sophisticated social media operation to track down who's leaking your stories to the press. That is.
But now Rebecca Vardy has hired a crack security team to work out who was actually leaking the stories to the press, right?
Yeah, because the accusation was that the leaks were coming from Rebecca Vardy's account, and Rebecca Vardy, easy to say, countered this by going back and saying multiple people had access to my account, which is not a good security practice.
It's the story that the internet needed this year, really. It's sort of Poirot for the internet age, and it's utterly delightful. Come and meet us all. We should remind you of this on October 30th, as it's better known. October 30th. I'm going to be rusty, everyone. On October 30th, we're holding our super amazing annual business event, Wired Smarter. You'll get to meet some of the smartest people focusing on the future of retail, money, and security, and Matt Burgess.
Thank you.
Yep. It's a fantastic day, and we hope to see you there. Do come and say hello. We don't bite. You'll also get to hear from superstar economist Mariana Mazzucato and Challenger Bank founder sensation Tom Blomfeld. You'd be stupid to miss out, especially because we've got a special offer for podcast listeners. Matt Reynolds, what is that offer?
Well, James, as you'll know, tickets are usually up to £1,000, but for podcast listeners only, we are offering a huge discount of 60% off any ticket. That means tickets will now range from £60 to £300 plus VAT per ticket, and it says here, wow. So to redeem that offer, it's for a limited time only, so make sure you kind of get in there early, and for a limited number, you can book your tickets online at wired.uk/smarterpod60. Say that again, wired.uk/smarterpod60.
It's a great offer. It's a great event. We look forward to seeing you there. Facts. What did you learn this week, Matt Burgess?
This week I learnt that the medieval version of London Bridge, which was completed in 1209 and used until the early 19th century, had shops, houses, churches and a gatehouse across it. And when I was watching TV, I learned that it used to take up to around 2 hours to cross the bridge because it was so busy and bustling. And this is like a distance of 100, 200 metres at most.
That's one bustling bridge.
London Bridge today is the really boring one, right? It's just the flat one, but everyone gets it confused with Tower Bridge, which is the one with the big towers, which is really pretty.
Bonus bridge trivia. Vicky Turk, what did you learn this week?
I learned this week that workers at Uber call themselves Uberettos. So in the vein of Google employees calling themselves Googlers and Twitter workers calling themselves Tweets, in the company's early days, Uber people apparently chose Uberetto as their nickname. And I got that from Super Pumped by Mike Isaac, which just so happens to be our current book club read. So if you're interested in more interesting facts about Uber, you should join the Wired Book Club. You can get started at wired.co.uk/superpumped.
Nice. Who hasn't had a fact yet?
I have not. So I found out that the UK's most popular pair is the conference pair. I think we'll all be familiar. That's your standard pair, basically. It makes up more than 90% of all pair production in the UK. But where did the name conference pair come from? Well, it's because that very same pair won the first prize at the 1888 Apple and Pear Conference in Chiswick. So it's literally named after a conference.
What on earth are you reading to find this out?
I listened to a podcast, The Illusionist, all about words, and it was about, mentioned this pair fact. It's great.
So to actually learn things, you listen to other podcasts. Yeah, with like a secondary school.
I'm cheating on this podcast, yeah. I just recycle them and bring them in.
Well, I mean, you've done better than me. I've learned absolutely nothing. It's my, fourth day back after 5 months on paternity leave, so I basically have no brain. So I'm going to shut up for most of this edition of the podcast until I work out how to do my job again. So let's get on with the first story.
Back, James.
Well, thank you. I mean, I didn't really want any fanfare, but go on. Matt Burgess, are you pleased?
Best day of my life.
There you go. Matt Reynolds?
The best day of your life was the 4th day. Seems kind of specific.
Yeah, I spent 3 days getting used to James's presence again, and then the 4th one, it really hit home.
Good. First story, Vicky, is about Brexit language. We found another way to talk about Brexit on the podcast. I'm so pleased.
Yes, well, this is quite interesting actually, and sort of related to your pair fact, Matt Reynolds, and how we kind of, get where we get words from and how language evolves. So as we all know, language changes over time, and it's affected by cultural, social, and political trends. Brexit being no different. Brexit itself is, of course, a new word in our vocabulary that only came into existence a few years ago, despite the fact that we've now heard it so many times we're fed up of it. And it actually came from Grexit. Brexit wasn't the first country to have an exit portmanteau.
Was this when Greggs tried to leave the European Union?
This was when there was a lot of discussion about Greece and the euro and so on, and Greece leaving, Brexit. But now, I think that's pretty much been forgotten, certainly in the UK, and everyone just talks about Brexit. Well, anyway, I spoke to some linguists and other language experts about how Brexit is affecting our vocabulary and the way we use language. So there's 3 kind of main new ways that words are coming into our modern day vocabulary. One is completely new words, things like Brexit, those neologisms and portmanteaus. We've also seen others like regrexit. Remember that one? Bit less successful.
Yeah, really.
Didn't stick around for as long. In fact, the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, has so far only introduced Brexit of all the new Brexit-related words into the dictionary because it only adds words that it thinks will have quite a long shelf life. And as we've seen, some of them do not. A second category of kind of newish word is existing words that then gain a new meaning. So if you think of the words leave and remain, they now have a whole set of new connotations that they did not before, and so do leaver and remainer. So the OED definition for remainer is a person who remains or stays, which obviously is still accurate, or an archaic alternative to remainder. But if you call someone a remainer now, you're probably implying an awful lot more than just someone who is standing still.
Or the leftover when you've done long division.
Exactly.
There we go. And gammon as well, I suppose, although it's probably not made it into the dictionary yet as an insult.
Well, we will get onto all sorts of imagery and metaphors.
I can't wait.
And food is actually very fertile ground for that. The third type of new old word is archaic words coming back. So a good example of this is prorogue, which everyone now throws around as if they've been saying it their whole lives, but I'm convinced no one knew what that word meant until a few weeks ago.
And still don't.
Possibly.
So why has Brexit resulted in this language change that we're now seeing?
So obviously this is something that we see for any kind of cultural or political trend. Language does evolve, and the words we use are very important. So a lot of the terms around Brexit have become kind of slogans. They've got a lot of political meaning behind them. Things like Brexiteer and Remona, for example, a different version of leaver and remainer. Brexiteer has that kind of evocation of musketeer or buccaneer or pioneer, and that's probably not by mistake.
So are we saying Brexiteer is actually a positive thing used by Brexiteers to describe themselves? Because I always thought the Brexiteer was meant to suggest a kind of a gung-ho but slightly inept kind of way of doing things.
Well, so this is very interesting because a lot of these words say as much about the person using them as they do about the person they're trying to describe. So if you think of Ramona is probably a clearer example. The type of person who will refer to someone as a Ramona, you probably have a very clear picture in your head of who that might be and why they would refer to someone who voted Remain in the referendum in that way. But these terms are often used to kind of signal an in-group identity. By putting people who voted Remain in that Ramona camp, I'm distancing myself from them and I'm kind of forging an identity which is antithetical to that. And so this can have kind of real world impact because we've heard a lot about, the division in the country and so on. And this kind of terminology contributes to that. We end up kind of identifying people by this one facet of their life. Just because you voted a certain way in a referendum, now we kind of forge a whole identity around that. You are a Leaver, you are a Remainer, you are a Brexiteer, you are a Ramona. So it can have kind of a real impact on then the further political proceedings. It's almost like a kind of never-ending circle.
And does this have an impact on how we feel about things? Does it make it harder, for instance, to have, negotiations across the aisle if you're kind of going to lump people in as a Leaver? It kind of suggests you've predefined your idea of what they're doing. So is this actually hindering us, the language we use? Is it stopping us having useful conversations about Brexit?
I think there's definitely potential negatives there, and a lot of these words, they're not introduced by accident. A lot of them come from politicians or political groups or activists in the first place. They don't always catch on, but when they do, people come up with this for a reason, for a slogan or to get their message across. And one expert I spoke to, Veronica Koffler, she's a linguist, and she says that the way we talk about things can really influence how we feel about them. So she talks about something called framing. And she gives the example that in the EU, discussions about Brexit are largely framed as diplomatic discussions, whereas she's found that in the UK, they're more framed like business negotiations. And she says that this can potentially lead to a clash or a misunderstanding because people are seeing the same situation in a completely different way. And so sometimes it might not translate.
And speaking of clashes, we've seen a lot of sort of discussion in the last couple of weeks around sort of some of the language that's being used around Brexit and sort of what it means and its, I guess, the metaphors and everything behind it.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of people very upset at particularly the current government, the kind of language they're using, phrases like enemies of the people and this imagery of loyalty and traitors. It's very divisive and something that, carries a certain moral weight, I guess, with it. And there's certainly a discussion to be had there as to whether this linguistic innovation is a good thing or not. But yeah, imagery and metaphor can be a very effective way to make an idea stick because it can evoke kind of a whole story just in one or two words. So if you think of Boris Johnson uses an awful lot of imagery and metaphor. If you think of him positioning himself as the Hulk, remember that? And then referring to Jeremy Corbyn as a chicken or a big girl's blouse. Like it or not, that's very effective. It gets message across, it tells a narrative, it really puts that character in your mind. You think Hulk, and that has a whole set of connotations with it that he doesn't have to explicitly explain, we all just know it anyway. And there's lots of metaphors around the Brexit discussion, things like cherry picking, having your cake and eating it. I told you, James, food, very fertile ground for metaphor. And, how we see ourselves in the relationship with the EU. Sometimes it's talked of in terms of marriage and divorce, the divorce bill, how much money will we owe? Sometimes it's talked about in terms of a family. We're part of the European family. There are brothers over the pond. But all of these have very kind of problematic links as well. Not all families get on very well. Marriages, that's a very specific type of special relationship. Do we really want to see ourselves in that way? So the way that we talk about things can belie the way that we think about things.
It makes you wonder how long some of these, particularly the neologisms, are going to stick around. Like, how long is Brexiteer going to be part of the English vernacular? How long is Ramona going to stick around? Once all of this is done, whichever way it ends up being done, are these still going to be, when you see someone in the street, you're going to think, oh, they must be a Ramona. They must be a Brexiteer, positively or negatively. Or do these things have quite a short shelf life?
Some of them for sure. So the example I gave earlier, that Regrexit, that made a sort of news point, a political point at the time when newspapers first used it, but it didn't really stick. Maybe just because it's a bit too complex, a bit complicated.
Kind of crap, isn't it?
Brexit, I think, will definitely, obviously, go down in the history books. That's what this political situation has come to be called. It's probably what we will refer to it in the future when we look back at the history of today. And leave and remain, I think, in that context will be understood. But I think you're right, maybe we will have less need for words like Brexiteer when it's no longer current.
It's kind of interesting, because I guess if you think of something like the Luddites, they're a very specific movement of people, and then that became a term that became, applied to a sense of a kind of technologically regressive person. I wonder if we're going to be talking about Brexiteers in 150 years, but instead that'll mean people that, I don't know, have a kind of a less fact-based but more nationalistic and hubristic approach to doing things. I wonder, it'd be kind of cool if it expands beyond it.
And intriguingly, in your own personal definition of Brexiteer there, I think you've given away a bit of your own thoughts too, which is interesting how language works.
Does it suggest that I'm a Ramona?
Well, I'm sure some people may interpret it that way.
This podcast is no place for politics.
But, it just goes to show how we all bring, although these, we can all use the same words, we also bring a subjective kind of analysis and interpretation to that. So it's all a big mess.
But is this just a kind of linguistic curiosity, or does this have real political impact? Is the way we're talking about Brexit going to change how things happen?
Some people argue that it could. Obviously, I gave the example earlier about, certain terms fueling division. I think there's definitely a case for that. One linguist I spoke to, Jonathan Charters-Black, he has a book out soon on the metaphor of Brexit, and he suggests we might not even have had Brexit without the word. So this alludes to an idea that, language can play a role in shaping our political reality. And he says, something like EU Leavers campaign may have been less successful. It's just less catchy, it's less evocative. Maybe it wouldn't have taken hold in the same way. And this is why people argue a lot over the wording on ballot papers when we have votes, when we have referendums. And Jonathan Charters-Black, he suggested to me that maybe the word remain was the wrong choice because he thinks it has sort of negative potential connotations when you see that, maybe even unconscious ones that you don't notice. And he thinks even switching it out for something like stay might have been better, but obviously we'll never really know. If there were ever to be a second referendum or a referendum on Scottish independence or anything like that, I'm sure people will argue a lot on the exact wording of those questions, and that I think is evidence that language can affect the way things work in reality.
Unfortunately for you, Matt Reynolds, the Brexiteer is out the bag.
It is, yeah. But, maybe if we get a people's vote, another...
Stop it right now.
Well, people's vote is a really interesting one, actually, because a lot of the linguistic innovation we've seen around Brexit has been on the Leave side. And people's vote is a strong example of the Remain side kind of coming up with a way to use language to promote their cause. People's vote, obviously, very evocative, talking about, it's basically another referendum, right? But we didn't call the first one the people's vote, even though it's essentially asking the people to vote on something. And there's a reason why it's been positioned in that way.
Change UK, the independent group, is a very good example of the opposite of that. Second story, Matt Burgess. You've been quite quiet because we've been talking about politics. Running. You love running.
Yeah, something much more wholesome now. So depending on when you're listening to this, there is a new science-fueled attempt at running the first sub-2-hour marathon that is taking place or has already taken place, which is, if you're listening to this in the near future, it's due to take place on Saturday morning, and it's already happened if you're listening to it after that.
But it doesn't really matter if it's happened or not, or if he's managed to, that was very confusing, or if he's managed to do it or not. The very nature of the attempt is fascinating in the science. that was rubbish too. But go on, tell us about it.
Okay, so Kenyan athlete Eliud Kipchoge is running 4.4 laps of a 9-kilometre course, or has run 4.4 laps of a 9-kilometre course. But we're going to leave that one now. Around Vienna, and it's the second time that Kipchoge has attempted to run the distance under 2 hours. So in 2017, at a Nike-sponsored effort called Breaking 2, Kipchoge came agonisingly close to the mark. He ran 2 hours and 25 seconds, which is 1 second slower per mile than was needed to get under the barrier.
Just to stop you there, it would have been quite obvious early on, or did he lose a lot of time towards the end?
So when you're talking about 25 seconds over 2 hours, it can seep away very quickly, and I think it was about sort of beyond halfway through, he started to lose the odd couple of seconds, and I think by the time he was completing the last lap, because that was 17 laps, it was sort of very improbable that he was going to do this, because running 25 seconds faster or 26 seconds faster in a mile is a huge difference to your previous mile. So it was sort of touch and go, but it was evidently becoming more obvious that it wasn't quite going to happen that time around.
And that's because even though it sounds like a very short amount of time, the pressure that he's putting his body under to run at that pace for that amount of time, any loss over each lap or however many laps he's doing in Vienna can pretty much make it impossible very early on.
Yeah, it really can. And the biggest sort of challenge around this is it's obviously running very fast for a long time. To try and put it into some sort of context, the pace that he will have to run at to come under 2 hours is 2 minutes 50 per kilometre for 42 kilometres, or 4 minutes 34 and a half seconds per mile for 26 miles, which probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but for context, according to Run As Well, the average 5k time in the UK, which is equivalent to a park run, is 33 minutes and 54 seconds. For men, it's 29 minutes, and for women, it's 38 minutes. For Kipchoge to do a marathon under 2 hours, he has to run 5k in 14 minutes, 13 seconds, 8 times in a row. And if you want to break it down further, the world record for 100 metres held by Usain Bolt is around 9 seconds and 69 milliseconds, or something there or thereabouts. And Kipchoge to do this in a marathon distance has to do 422 100 metres in 17 seconds each.
And it's absolutely remarkable. And it's only shaving a couple of minutes off the time that he's running an actual marathon, and this one's being done under controlled conditions. But that extra 2 minutes is really, it seems, pushing the human body, and in this case, the greatest human body over a marathon distance that we've ever had, to its absolute limit, and potentially beyond it.
It is. So the big difficulty with this is running so fast for so long basically saps the body of energy, which obviously isn't a surprise. So on the science side, our muscles, when we exercise for a long time, use carbohydrates for energy, and this is stored as glycogen in the body, and it's why people sort of carb load or talk about eating lots of carbs and pasta before they go and run a very long way. And this gets depleted and becomes harder to run, and there are obviously other factors as well, but carbs are one of the big ones. And if you lose too much glycogen, your body starts to rely on burning fat, which is not very efficient as a way to create energy, and pretty obviously with elite marathon runners, they don't have a huge amount of body fat anyway.
So how's he going to get all of those extra carbohydrates that he needs while he's running into him? Is he going to be, chowing down on some chips in the mid-race?
Exactly, just a burger in the middle. No. So this is done through a couple of different ways, or can be done through different ways, which will be either sort of gels, which contain high amounts of carbohydrates, or also powdered drinks. So a powder mixed up into a drink, which then contains around sort of 80 grams of carbohydrate per 500 ml serving. And I think, speaking to a few experts around this, the sort of amount needed to sort of sustain your body for amount of time is between 60 and 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So he'll be taking on lots of carbohydrates in drinks, probably every couple of kilometres in small amounts, so it's not overloading his body with fluid at one time. So it becomes quite a sort of organisational and scientifically rigorous amount in terms of how often he has to take fluid and carbohydrates on.
So that solves the endurance problem. How can he increase his speed? I mean, I imagine he was pretty much maxed out in the last attempt at that 2 hours 25.
Yeah, so he said that last attempt took 100% out of him. This time around, there's a few things that are slightly different in terms of speed and his ability. When he did that before, the world record for a marathon was 2 hours and 2 minutes 57 or something around that barrier. These attempts don't actually count as an official world record, but he managed to shave 2 minutes off the fastest time that had ever been run for a marathon, which is way more than a lot of people thought he was going to do. So one thing, he's got a bit more sort of self-belief on his side this time around, because he knows it's a lot closer, and 26 seconds sounds a lot less than 3 minutes, and is definitely a lot less over sort of that distance. One of the big things that is part of sort of him running quicker is the sort of pacing strategy that they had. So they had this previously in Monza, but they've sort of tweaked it a little bit this time. So there'll be 7 people that are running around him. There's, I think, 5 in a V shape in front of him, and 2 sort of behind him just as well. And the reason behind this is to do with aerodynamics. So if you've ever seen like a big cycling race, you'll get a peloton, which is a group of riders all packed together, and they take it in turns at the front. So that person takes on most of the headwinds that's coming towards them, and essentially reduces drag for people behind them. And this is obviously, it's not as big an effect with running, because within cycling you're traveling much faster, but within running it still makes a difference. And by putting so many people in front of him and shielding the wind, and having a car in front of that as well, which is also shielding the wind.
An electric car.
Yes.
Probably quite important.
Yeah, and you don't want loads of fumes coming out of it while you're running. That will also increase the chances of making him go faster, essentially.
There was a little detail in your story that was really incredible, and obviously it will be lower for Kipchoge because he's running, but you found that cyclists, the resistance from the wind resistance, the drag can be reduced by 50 to 70% by riding in a peloton formation. So this, where I presume he's hidden inside, so the point of the V is ahead of him, and he's hiding inside it.
No, so the V, if you if you imagine a V, he is at the very bottom of the V, so it's sort of like the opposite way to how you would think, so not an arrowhead, but the other way around.
Oh, right.
Which I did actions for, but they don't really come across in a podcast.
You need like a whiteboard and a pointy stick.
Yes.
So like the arrow is pointing at him.
Yes, exactly. That's a good metaphor to do it.
With 2 people hiding behind him and a car. And the car also shows the time, right?
Yes, yeah. So they've got some lasers and stuff on the car, which will be shining on the ground, which is showing the paces, the speed to travel at.
So they're basically running on a laser line.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think there's a few like lanes within that, so they know where to run in terms of like the best positioning, so they're close enough to each other.
And if you happen to be in Vienna this weekend, although he might be starting at like 5 o'clock in the morning or something, right? But if you happen to be in Vienna, you can go and watch it. The last attempt was closed on a track in Monza this time. Anyone can go and see it.
Yeah, definitely. So it's open to the public, and that's one of the really big differences compared to last time around. So in 2017, there was like 200 or 300 people around about 100-meter stretch of tarmac at the Monza racetrack, whereas this time around, they're hoping, I guess depending sort of on the weather, even though if it's raining, you won't be doing it, they're hoping that people will line this track, and also sort of that encouragement will be another motivational mental factor.
So my question is, obviously this would not count as a world record because it's not race conditions. There's all kind of things that are being done to, help him along. What is the gap between these kind of ideal conditions and the kind of marathon times? As in, are people going to be like, well, that means we could do it in race conditions, or are people like, well, if it's perfect, you've got all this help, then yeah, we could do it, but it doesn't really prove that we can do it in normal conditions.
Yeah, this is one of the tricky things. And I think if he does do it, and even the 2 hours and 25 seconds that he did previously is still more than a minute ahead of the world record. So in 2018, he brought the world record down by about a minute and 18 seconds to 2:01:39, which was the biggest jump forward in 60 years. And he did that after this first attempt, so I think there was obviously a sort of psychological factor that obviously showed him he can do a lot more within race conditions, but still there's 1 minute and 39 seconds is quite a long time to bring down, especially when for a lot of the sort of marathon courses that are officially sanctioned for world records, they are a lot more sort of they're hillier in cases. The weather is a lot less predictable. So Vienna is supposed to be a very nice day when he's doing it for running. And I think that the challenge is still going to be, you might see people taking small chunks off that world record, but it would still be quite a while until an actual official race gets anywhere near 2 hours. But if he does it, then that will increase the sort of like motivation and self-belief of other people. They'll see it's possible.
Do you think he can do it?
I think that there's a good chance, I would say, but it's really hard to say. Like, he has a really good consistency and performance in the marathons that he's run. He's won 11 of the 12 that he's done and not had to pull out of any of them. He obviously believes in himself a lot. And when you're talking about 1 second a mile, maybe a big crowd surrounding you could provide that slight motivation just to push you on a little bit further. I don't know.
The big crowd featuring Matt Burgess?
Yes.
Of course. So you can help him. You can help him achieve this.
So essentially it'd be like I'm running under 2 hours.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're all part of the fun. Do head along to Vienna if it's not... No, hang on. You need to explain this again. When's he running it?
So he's running it on Saturday the 12th.
Yep.
And it's supposed to be sometime between 5 and 9 a.m. for starting. I think that's European time, and I think it's on YouTube as well.
And if it's beyond Saturday, of course, he would have already either done it or not done it, as we confusingly explained at the beginning. There we go. You can read all about that attempt that has either happened or not happened, or not even happened yet, on the Wired website. Always good to be clear on these things. Our third story is about CBD oil. What's that?
So, well, clearly, James, you've not been hanging out in health food shops like I do. So if you do spend much time hanging out in Holland and Barrett and other health food shops like that, you'll have come across this booming trend for cannabidiol, which is more commonly known as CBD oil. It can actually be in lots of different forms, but usually it's called CBD oil. And what it is a substance derived from the cannabis plant. It doesn't get you high, but is popularly used as a treatment for all kinds of conditions. You know, it's used for insomnia, it's used for anxiety, for chronic pain, although the science around all these different treatments is yet to be decided. But that hasn't stopped it growing to a £300 million industry in the UK. It's actually projected to be worth £1 billion per year by 2025. But it turns out that the CBD oil being sold on shelves and online doesn't always contain what it says on the bottle.
So is this a bit like multivitamins, but from weed?
Yeah, basically, and actually that's kind of how the law around it works, because it can't be listed as a medicinal product, because then it has to, I think, be regulated by the MHRA and go through all these different things. So it's essentially given as a kind of food supplement, and really people that are taking it to, you know, help out like with insomnia or whatever, or pain, but it's not really been clinically proven in those circumstances. We do know it helps with, for instance, childhood epilepsy, and it can be prescribed in the UK now, or cannabis can, but most people are not taking it for those reasons. They're taking it because it's kind of marketed as the next big wellness thing.
But what it's marketed as might not be what it actually is, and this is the story that we've reported this week.
Exactly. So this kind of all goes back. There's been a few different tests, actually, but some of the first tests were by the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis, which is kind of a industry body / think tank. And in June, it found that 62% of UK high street CBD oil products didn't contain the CBD content they promised on the label, and in fact one product that retailed for 90 quid had no measurable amount of CBD in it.
So it was just a bottle of grease?
Yeah, well it contained maybe some slightly kind of more worrying stuff. So where a lot of these might lack in the advertised CBD, some of them have THC, and you'll remember, listeners from last week's podcast, remember that THC is kind of the active psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, so that's the bit that gets you high. But in the UK, it's illegal to have levels above 1 milligram in any packet, and they found that actually lots of them had illegal levels of THC in them, and a lot of them also tested positive for cannabinol, which is really helpful because those of these things just sound exactly the same. CBN, which is another psychoactive and banned ingredient.
In quantities, not that I care, because whatever, but in quantities high enough to get you high, or we're still talking really, really low levels?
No, it's probably really, really low. So essentially, yeah, the government limit is set at 1 milligram, and I think that if you have any amount of THC in your product, then you need to have a home office license to sell it. But really, that level wouldn't really get you high, but it's because it's a restricted substance. It's not meant to be in there at all.
How have we got to this stage where we've got shops that are very sort of reputable organisations selling products that we don't really know what's going in them or what's happening and what's going on?
Yeah, it's kind of confusing, isn't it? Because it feels like, well, if people are selling these products, we should really know what's in them. I think the problem is that the CBD industry has kind of blown up a lot quicker than anyone imagined it, and also we're dealing with cannabis, which is a very poorly understood and complicated substance. So it contains over 400 unique compounds, and because of the restrictions on cannabis, especially in the UK in the past, it hasn't been particularly well studied. So there's not necessarily kind of uniform approaches for testing different chemicals within it. And of course, its medical use only became legal in the UK last November. So we're still kind of struggling with a lack of qualified cannabis chemists. And this kind of adds to this other problem, is there isn't really any quality control or manufacturing standards around it. So in the UK, we have a couple of agencies that could be looking around this. So there's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, who I just mentioned a little bit earlier, and the Food Standards Agency. But because both of these organisations are really under-resourced, it's not like they're coming in and stepping up and saying, look, we're going to set these standards. So at the minute, it's mostly been left for the industry itself to decide what is an okay level of CBD or THC, and that means there's quite a lot of inconsistencies.
Self-regulation is always good regulation, but if there's no need to regulate against these substances, as there aren't such strict regulations in place for multivitamins, which are equally as scientifically dubious in some claims, well, do we need to worry? Is there a problem here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So, I mean, essentially, although different kind of companies might say we've got this much CBD or this is the right amount, it has been shown that there's not really negative health effects around taking CBD. So it's not like there is necessarily a really acute health problem. Although, as we've seen in the US around THC vaping, there are perhaps health effects if THC has been mixed with certain things. In the vape case, it's mixed with oil, and that could potentially cause lung illness. So it's like there are tangential problems, but because of our regulations, our EU regulations around vaping, you don't have that kind of problem. And what we do know is that the kind of the regulations that exist at the minute, it states that basically you're not allowed to make medical claims about CBD. So CBD is only considered medically beneficial if it's given in a clinical dose, and obviously cannabis can now be prescribed in the UK in very, very specific circumstances. So what you shouldn't find is any products that are making medical claims like this can help you go to sleep, or it might whatever, cure your arthritis or ease your joint pain. It shouldn't have any of those kind of things. So it's sold in this kind of slightly vague way that health supplements often are, where it's like, take this and it might be part of a balanced diet and it might be helpful. But I think a lot of the hype around it is basically implying this could be a cure or this could be a help for all kinds of ailments. So it's very, very much implied, if not overtly stated.
So what's the solution to this? If the industry isn't going to be trusted to self-regulate, which it seems there's good evidence that it shouldn't right now, what can we do to make sure that when people buy these products, they are getting what it says on the tin?
Yeah, so that's the kind of difficult question. It's a little bit open-ended at the minute still. So in terms of those efforts for self-regulation, so the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis that I talked about a little bit earlier on has kind of set up this kind of industry body that it says is going to set standards and say, this is what we think should be, this is the right level and this is how you kind of test it. But ultimately, the question is, how do we kind of equip labs with finding the right equipment so they know the kind of right levels? And also this problem, like, do you really want to leave the regulation down to this think tank, the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis? Are they the ones that are best placed to say this is wrong or this is right? And obviously they'll have members that subscribe to them, they'll have members that don't subscribe to them. So does it become a kind of seal of authority, or is this just a way of, certain brands trying to stand out in this very competitive industry? So in the absence of very rigorous government regulation, we've got this weird sense where some it's a bit like how you get like Sainsbury's has its own fair trade spin-off, and Tesco's now is like, we'll do our own fair trade thing. It's all like, if you leave these different places to come up with their own terms of quality, it becomes very, very difficult for users to differentiate between the two. But of course, if CBD doesn't have any health impacts, maybe it's less important for that to matter in the first place. So it's very, very kind of a dodgy territory, and it all feels very new.
We're talking about two problems, basically, that it isn't what it says on the tin, and that it doesn't do what it says on the tin, or it kind of claims beyond what it can do. But this is the problem that we've had in the vitamin industry and the supplement industry ever since it appeared decades ago, and we've still got vitamin C supplements that provide you with 4,000% the daily recommended intake of vitamin C, and people buy them and take them, and there's no medical evidence that it is a good idea to take them, and there are very strict rules under what claims companies that sell these vitamins can make, and you see the adverts for them, and unless you're really paying attention, you might not spot the clever linguistic tricks that they're pulling to make it seem like you should be taking these, and actually you don't need to.
Yeah, exactly. It's that whole question of a kind of, when a thing becomes a runaway health trend, it's very, very difficult to kind of move that back. Like you said, there's a lot of studies that say that really vitamins are often very much not useful. It's too much, you can't synthesize it, it's not even in the most useful form to use anyway. But I think the vitamin industry is worth something like $35 billion or something, so it doesn't stop it. I think we see a similar thing around protein. Loads of things are marketed as like, this is a protein shake and protein bar, but actually most people get too much protein, they can't really use it, but it doesn't stop people thinking, they want to use it and it's the next thing. So I think at the minute, when there's so much noise around CBD, and to be clear, there are probably medical benefits to using cannabis, and they are being kind of experimented with, you're going to have so much hype. And I think part of that, the problem is that if you had a substance that some people have said, this is really important to me, it might be useful, but has been neglected by the medical community and government for so long, it's going to have a pretty big groundswell, especially when suddenly it becomes able to be bought. So we're kind of dealing with, 40 years of kind of repressed feelings towards cannabis, and now it's exploded in this slightly dodgy world. And I think it's going to take quite a while before we start to really work out what's useful and what's not.
It's because the regulation and the science hasn't gotten out ahead of this thing, and now people can go out and buy it, even though it's only derived from cannabis and has limited medical benefits that are untested and sort of unknown. It's seen as a good thing. People want to have it, and they're going to believe it does whatever it claims.
Yeah, exactly. And as long as they, or at least they're going to believe whatever is kind of said about it. If you hear, this person took CBD and it helped with their sleep, and then I buy CBD chocolate, I might think, well, maybe that helps with my sleep. And so there's this whole sense that actually maybe, people are trying to get something out of it, but it's not really clear what they're meant to do or what they can do. But the only thing that seems certain is the industry is going to keep getting better, so maybe we'll see some super big players that start to try and make everything a bit more uniform, but at the minute we're only starting to see the very beginnings of this kind of uniformity and regulation.
And as with all the stories that we talked about on the podcast this week, you can read that on wired.co.uk. We'll include a link in the podcast notes. We've got one email that we wanted to read out this week, which is related sort of to what we were just discussing just then, but to a story that you guys talked about last week, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So Dave wrote in, this is about, we were talking about the vaping backlash last week, so those deaths in the US that are kind of based around maybe illicit vapes, maybe THC vaping, and Dave wrote in, as someone who has for the past year used THC vapes purchased on the dark web, I would like to comment on your segment in the latest pod. He says, the products I purchased, most claiming to be US imported, I'm assuming Dave's in the UK, had huge varieties in quality of packaging and the cartridge itself. So he says some of them came in a Perspex sealed box, but other of them came in loose packaging when the cartridge was sticky. And this points to this massive problem that actually, if you're buying kind of non-regulated vapes, it's very, very difficult to know exactly what you're getting. And Dave touched on another point where he says, one thing I felt your podcast overlooked is that THC vaping is quite unlike conventional smoking of marijuana. The act itself is much more subtle because you've got a small device and little odor, so you can kind of do it a little bit more openly. And the dose is, in theory, smaller and more controllable due to the the kind of digital reader that makes it you kind of can limit the amount that you have. And he's saying this might tempt people to vape a lot more. And actually, this is something that's kind of come up with the vaping experts that I spoke to. They say that because the social taboo around vaping is a little bit less, and you can do it more places, you can do it in the street, and also if you try to smoke many cigarettes in a row, you'll realise it's quite difficult to do that. It's not difficult to vape for a long time. That actually people might increase their uptake of nicotine and especially increase their uptake of THC-containing vapes. So there's this extra problem that actually people might switch to vapes, that's more healthy, but there's nothing to kind of stop you. And he says that might be where a lot of these health issues are coming from. And I think that anecdotally, at least, that does seem to be the case with THC vapes, at least.
Dave, thanks very much for your email. Really appreciate you writing in. Anyone that has any thoughts on any of the stories that we talked about on the podcast this week, or anything else that's on your mind, as someone outside the door drops a very large heavy metal poll, hope you enjoyed hearing that. It's podcast@wired.co.uk. We really do love hearing from you. The more emails, the better, especially if they're about Matt Burgess. podcast@wired.co.uk. And we will see you again next week. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.